At 2047 in the morning, I closed my laptop, stood up from my desk, and walked out of the building without telling anyone. That wasn't an emotional decision. That was the final step of a process that had already finished in my head. I had worked for that company for 11 years, long enough to know how the place really functioned once the slides were closed and the town halls ended. Long enough to understand that companies don't betray people suddenly. They do it quietly, politely, and with paperwork that sounds reasonable if you don't read between the lines. I wasn't the loud one. I wasn't the visionary who liked to hear himself talk. I was the one people called when something broke at 2 in the morning and needed to be fixed without attention. I built systems that didn't make headlines. I prevented problems that never became stories. I carried responsibility in ways that didn't translate cleanly into performance reviews. And I trained people. That was always my real contribution. I took raw talent and turned it into something useful, sustainable. One of those people would eventually be the reason I walked out. I hired my mentee when he was still trying to figure out how to wear authority without sounding insecure. Smart guy, fast learner. He had ambition, but it wasn't reckless. It just needed direction. I saw potential. And more importantly, I saw where he would fail if someone didn't intervene early. So I intervened. I taught him how to speak when executives were in the room and when to stay quiet. I taught him how to take credit without making enemies, and how to let others take credit when it bought him goodwill. I showed him how to survive mistakes without leaving fingerprints. When he stumbled, I didn't escalate it. I corrected it privately. When he succeeded, I stepped back and let leadership notice him. That wasn't generosity. That was strategy. Over the years, he rose quickly. Promotions came. Visibility increased. His name started appearing on decks I used to present. I didn't mind. This was the natural order. You build people so the system survives without you. At least, that's what we tell ourselves. The company started changing around us. New executives came in. Consultants followed. The language shifted. Everything became about growth curves, succession planning, and retention risk. Younger talent was described as high potential. Experience was described as valuable but costly. No one said it directly, but you could feel the tilt. I didn't resist it. I watched. Bonus season arrived near the end of the year, and that's when things finally became clear. Retention bonuses weren't common where we worked. They were reserved for people leadership believed they couldn't afford to lose. So when I received a meeting invite from HR and my VP, I assumed it was procedural, maybe an adjustment, maybe a quiet thank you for keeping things stable during a turbulent year. The meeting lasted 12 minutes. They thanked me for my consistency. They acknowledged my leadership. They praised my reliability. Words like foundational and trusted were used. Then they slid a single-page document across the table. $25,000. I read it carefully. No tricks, no conditions. Just a retention bonus, modest by industry standards, but respectable enough on paper. I nodded and thanked them. Then my VP added something that changed the temperature of the room. He said retention bonuses had been allocated selectively this year, based on long-term growth potential. He said it casually, like it was self-explanatory. I didn't ask any questions. Silence has always been more useful to me than confrontation. People fill silence with truth if you let them. 2 days later, I ran into my mentee outside the executive wing. He looked different, not arrogant, just lighter, like someone who had just been told something reassuring about his future. He congratulated me on my bonus. Apparently, word traveled fast. Then he hesitated, and without meaning to, he told me about his $85,000 retention bonus, immediate vesting, separate from his annual compensation. He said it quickly, like he wasn't sure how I'd react, like he didn't want to seem ungrateful or disloyal. I congratulated him. I meant it. This wasn't his doing. He hadn't asked for it. He had simply been chosen. But in that moment, something locked into place. Because the issue wasn't the money. It was the math. And here's the part that deserves your attention, because this is where most people misunderstand situations like this. The bonus wasn't an insult. It was information. Let me ask you something. If the person you trained was paid more than 3 times what you were paid to stay, what would that tell you about how the company saw your future there? That question stayed with me long after the hallway conversation ended. I didn't change my behavior immediately. I didn't withdraw. I didn't act wounded. I kept doing my job, just more deliberately. I started paying attention to patterns instead of reassurances. Meetings shifted. Decisions I used to make were now framed as recommendations. Projects I historically owned were reassigned under the guise of leadership development. My role moved subtly from authority to advisor. Still respected, still included, just no longer essential. When I spoke, people listened. When my mentee spoke, people acted. That distinction matters more than titles ever will. The company wasn't pushing me out. That would have required courage. They were letting me age out, slowly, politely. With compliments and diminishing influence, I'd seen it happen to others. I just hadn't expected to recognize it so clearly while it was happening to me, so I stopped reacting and started preparing. I reviewed my responsibilities. I reviewed my contracts. I reviewed the systems I maintained. There was one core platform I had built over 6 years. It wasn't legally proprietary, but it was operationally fragile. It relied on judgment calls, institutional memory, and context the documentation couldn't fully capture. I didn't hoard knowledge. I didn't hide anything. I simply stopped compensating for gaps that no one else had bothered to close. When issues arose, I addressed exactly what was assigned. Nothing more. Nothing less. Late nights became common again, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to see how the system behaved without my interventions smoothing over edges. I wanted to know how much weight it could actually carry. The answer was, not much. Small delays began to stack. Minor decisions took longer. People started asking questions they had never needed to ask before. Nothing dramatic. Just friction. The kind of friction that doesn't trigger alarms but quietly erodes efficiency. And then came the night. It was a Tuesday. No deadline. No emergency. The office was quiet in that hollow way large buildings get after midnight. I was finalizing a quarterly risk assessment I had authored every year for the past 5. Historically, I presented it to the board. This year, I wasn't invited. My mentee would be presenting instead. I finished the document, saved it, closed the file. I leaned back in my chair and checked the time. 2047 a.m. I thought about the meeting with HR, about the word selectively, about the assumption that I would always be there to catch what others missed, to stabilize what others accelerated. Then, I shut down my computer. I sent a short email to HR and my VP. Professional, appreciative, effective immediately. I left my badge on my desk and walked out. No announcement, no exit interview, no dramatic confrontation, just absence. The company didn't feel it right away. Systems like that rarely do. Momentum carries them forward for a while. People assume someone else is handling things. 3 weeks later, my phone rang. It was my VP. He asked if I'd consider a temporary consulting arrangement, just a few hours a week, to help with the transition. I declined. A month later, the platform I mentioned earlier began to misbehave. Not catastrophically, just enough to slow operations. Decisions took longer. Issues that used to be resolved quietly started surfacing in meetings. They hired consultants. Expensive ones. My mentee called me once. He didn't ask for help. He asked how I was doing. I told him I was fine. I asked him how things were going. He paused before answering. I never went back. I didn't need to. Within a year, I moved into a quieter role elsewhere. Smaller team, clear boundaries, no mentoring responsibilities, no illusion of mutual loyalty. I heard through industry channels that retention bonuses were discontinued the following year. Budget realignments, strategic shifts. My mentee stayed. He earned his place. But the company learned something they hadn't priced correctly the first time. Experience doesn't demand attention. It doesn't argue. It doesn't compete. It just leaves when it's no longer wanted. If this story feels familiar, you already understand why some decisions are made in silence. And if stories like this resonate with you, you'll recognize the next one when it finds you. Some exits aren't loud. They just change the balance forever.